Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and to our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. One bit of housekeeping, please check that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. It's always appreciated to avoid musical interludes, especially when they're not planned. We will post the program within 24 hours on our website for everyone's future reference as well. And of course, our internet viewers can always send questions or comments simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion today is Matthew Spalding. Dr. Spalding is Vice President for American Studies and Director of our B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles in Politics. He is a constitutional scholar and authority on American political thought and religious liberty, serves as a fellow at the Claremont Institute, an adjunct fellow at the Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship, part of Hillsdale College, and was executive editor of the Heritage Guide to the Constitution. Please join me in welcoming Matt Spalding. Matt?
Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation for our discussion today about the Boy Scouts. The mission of the Boy Scouts of America is to prepare young people to make ethical and moral choices over their lifetimes by instilling in them the values, the Scout Oath, and the Scout Law. This from my son's Scout Handbook. The oath speaks of duty to God and country, helping others, and keeping physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight. The law promises that Scouts will be trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. Today there are some 2.7 million youth members of the Boy Scouts of America and about 1 million adult Scout leaders. Over the years there have been 100 million men and boys involved in the Boy Scouts, about 2 million of whom have become Eagle Scouts. Two of those, hopefully, will be Jack Whalen, Ed's son, and my son Joseph, who has been involved with the Cub Scouts throughout since he could at the very beginning, has now just recently becoming a first-class Scout and is on his road ahead. The Boy Scouts have had some controversy for some time. In the 1980s, the Boy Scouts of America were attacked because it affirms belief in God, requiring members to do the same. You might recall that debate. At the time, the Scouts were forced off of military bases because the organization requiring duty to God amounted to a First Amendment violation of the establishment of religion. In recent years, that debate has centered around its policy that homosexuality violates its morally based membership standards. The currently policy states, and I quote, "While the Boy Scouts of America does not proactively inquire about the sexual orientation of employees, volunteers, or members, we do not grant membership to individuals who are open or avowed homosexuals or who engage in behavior that would become a distraction to the mission of the Boy Scouts of America." This policy was upheld in 2000 in Boy Scouts of America versus Dale, a Supreme Court decision which held that the constitutional right of freedom of association allows a private organization, like the Boy Scouts, to exclude a person from membership when the presence of that person affects in a significant way the group's ability to advocate public or private viewpoints. The policy was reiterated by the Scouts as recently as 2012. In April of this year, under pressure, the Boy Scouts of America Executive Committee proposed for consideration a new policy. They deferred that policy decision to the members of the National Council. The proposal makes 3 key changes to membership policy. 1, quoting, "Scouting is a youth program, and any sexual conduct, whether homosexual or heterosexual, by youth of scouting age is contrary to the virtues of scouting." 2, the Boy Scouts of America does not have an agenda on the matter of sexual orientation, and resolving this complex issue is not the role of the organization, nor may any member use scouting to promote or advance any social or political position or agenda, unquote. And 3, while the policy would maintain current standards for adults, it would state, quote, "No youth may be denied membership in the Boy Scouts of America on the basis of sexual orientation or preference alone," unquote. Scouting's National Council will vote on this proposal at the National Annual Meeting on May 22nd through 24th. The question today is this a prudent compromise, or is it a fatal concession? Recognizing that this matter is before us and it's been proposed in good faith, for a deep concern about the well-being of scouting, it may seem on its face to be a reasonable compromise. But there are many concerned, however, that the change will undermine the mission of scouting and jeopardize its programs and therefore the good works it does for this country. For the sake of the discussion, I will group these into three broad areas to give us some organization, and then we'll have our three expert panelists talk about it. One area of concern is definitional. This is a bifurcated policy, distinguishing between youth members and adult members. Is that a stable distinction? Will it hold up? Will it hold up especially in court? Will this distinction, however, on the other hand, perhaps trigger years of litigation against the Boy Scouts to pursue that policy further and further? The second area of concern is a more practical area. Stemming from the first, is this policy one that can be carried out in practice? We can think of wide and unforeseen range of practical scenarios in virtually every aspect of scouting, not the least of which is camping and staying in pup tents. How is this policy to be carried out as a practical matter in an organization dedicated to forming the character of young boys? Third area of concern is a broader one, more philosophical, one of moral confusion. The concern is this will sow moral confusion in the scouting organization as a whole. Confusion about its religious commitment, about duty to God, about its ability to distinguish and uphold moral values, about its understanding of fatherhood, about character formation, about mentoring of boys into upright young men. These three areas of concern have us concerned, which is why at the Heritage Foundation we're deeply concerned about this matter and strongly oppose and recommend that the National Council not make this change. But to get into the details of this and to make arguments and points and think about these questions further and answer the question, or at least consider the question whether this is a good compromise or a concession, I'd like to turn the panel over to our three experts. And I'll introduce them to you and in the order they're going to speak. The first is Edward Whalen. Ed, in addition to being the father of a scout, is the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. You might be familiar with his work. He writes extensively at National Review Online's Bench Memos. If you've not seen them, I highly recommend them to you. Some of the more direct and pithy legal analysis for the public available today. Secondly, we'll hear from Kathy Roos. Kathy is a senior legal fellow at the Family Research Council. I got to know her, and she had an extensive career working on the Hill as the chief counsel for the Subcommittee on the Constitution. She has since then done extensive work in legal areas, writing Supreme Court briefs and giving expert testimony on questions surrounding questions like these, marriage and moral values. And lastly, we will hear from John Stemberger. John is an attorney in Orlando, Florida, but he is here today as someone who has been deeply involved at every level in scouting, a former scoutmaster himself, and the founder of something called onmyhonor.net, which is an organization of scouts who are deeply concerned about these changes. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Ed Whalen for some remarks. We'll hear from each of the three speakers, and then we'll have some time for questions. Ed, thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks to all of you for being here. If any change to the existing policy is warranted, my modest proposition is that the change needs to be done right. If the BSA decides to revise its policy on youth members while retaining its policy on adult leaders, it needs to spell out carefully what its revised policy on youth members means, and it needs to avoid jeopardizing its ability to defend its policy on adult leaders. The proposed new policy flunks these basic tests. It's either a bait and switch or it's reckless, but it is not a competent policy that anyone should support. Those who share the Executive Committee's supposed commitment to retain the BSA policy against adult leaders who are open or avowed homosexuals should therefore vote against the proposed new policy. Now, let me focus my comments primarily on how this proposed new policy would undermine the Boy Scouts' ability to retain their policy on adult leaders. Basically, this cuts the heart out the victory that the Boy Scouts achieved in Boy Scouts v. Dale. That victory that Matt referred to rested heavily on the BSA's position that homosexual conduct is inconsistent with the values it seeks to instill. Where do you see any statement like that in the new resolution? Nowhere. Indeed, instead what you see are statements that seem directed the other way. Beyond that, the new policy would allow youth scouts to be leaders within their troops. You could have 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old openly gay scouts who have leadership positions. Now, you might favor that, you might oppose that. My limited point here is that it is inconceivable, I think, that the scouts will be able to maintain their policy against adult leaders who are openly gay when they allow scouts who are openly gay to have leadership positions in the troop. What has the BSA had to say on this point? Well, it recently issued some points of clarification, supposed points of clarification to respond to criticisms. It had nothing to say in answer to this criticism, even though the Washington Post, in arguing for a more permissive policy, had pointed out this same basic inconsistency. So the question has to be presented. How can you, the BSA, maintain your policy against adult leaders when you no longer are taking the position that homosexual conduct is inconsistent with the values that you seek to instill? I also want to highlight that the proposed resolution misstates the Scouts' current policy. It claims it claims to make a change in saying that it will have a policy where you won't be denied membership purely on the basis of being gay. That's the existing policy. The existing policy says you'll be denied membership only if you are openly or avowedly homosexual. So it's not a good sign that the Scouts can't even accurately describe their current policy in making the case for a change away from that. So again, the question has to be, is there a significant difference between a 17-year and 11-month-old youth leader and, say, an 18-year-old or older adult leader? A difference so significant that the BSA could plausibly be thought to hold and to be advancing a position that homosexual conduct is inconsistent with the values it seeks to instill, when it allows open or avowed homosexuals to be youth leaders but not adult leaders? The BSA's failure to address this fundamental question is telling, I'd submit. I also want to highlight that back in January, the BSA national leadership proposed an entirely different new policy, a policy, a so-called local policy that would let the sponsoring organizations decide whether or not to have openly gay leaders, adults and scouts. It's quickly abandoned that. That policy was, I think, as ill-considered as this one is. But what the two policies have in common is that neither has given any serious attention to Boy Scouts versus Dale and to how to maintain the Boy Scouts' victory in that case in order to make sure that the Scouts can actually enable troops to maintain the ban on adult leaders. What this demonstrates, I think, is that the BSA's top leaders, especially the corporate heads who have come on apparently to drive this change, aren't serious about finding some middle ground. Instead, they're trying to snooker and bamboozle local Scout leaders and parents to embrace a proposal that isn't sustainable and that will lead in short order to a wholesale abandonment of the existing policy against openly gay adult leaders. Whether or not one supports that abandonment, the dissembling way that the BSA's top leaders are pursuing it is a shameful violation of their duty to be trustworthy. Let me sum it up. Someone who prefers the existing BSA policy over a wholesale repeal of that policy might be tempted to support the BSA's resolution as some sort of middle ground compromise. But there is no reason to think that resolution would adopt a workable and sustainable approach that would survive litigation attack. It instead would operate as the way station to a wholesale repeal, the first step in a very quick two-step surrender. So anyone who favors the existing BSA policy over a wholesale repeal should vote against the resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Kathy?
Thank you. And it's a delight to be here. Thanks for the opportunity. I share all of the legal cautionary notes that Ed has just outlined. But in my few minutes, I'd like to cover more about the context in which this controversy finds itself, with an emphasis on Ed's point about snookering and bamboozling, and to talk about how we got from Dale in 2000 to Grapevine, Texas in 2013. Now, last month, when the Executive Committee of the National Board of the Boy Scouts of America released the wording of their resolution, it was a surprise to many people, because at that point, it was very well known that the Executive Committee at the Boy Scouts wanted to get rid of the prohibition against open homosexuality on the part of everyone in Scouts, youth members and adult leaders. Their position was very clearly known. So why did their resolution address youth only? And for the reasons, and I share Ed's concern, that I, in fact, think that it's not a mistake that they drafted their resolution to address youth only, not thinking through the possible pitfalls that they will encounter, but that, in fact, it was by design. This policy is incoherent and unsustainable, both as a practical matter and as a legal matter, and that is by design. Now, as a practical matter, under this new proposed policy, a scout would be in perfectly good standing to be open and avowed homosexual all through his career, starting as young as you might want to be openly and avowedly homosexual. And I'm going to talk about something later with the Girl Scouts, and that can apparently start at 7 years old today. Welcome to the modern world. And that behavior would be perfectly consistent with the scouting code up until the very moment he turns 18. Now, what is his troop leader to do at that point in order to be compliant with this new policy? The troop leader would have to take some action against the scout. Well, what is he going to do? Would he do anything? And I submit he's not going to do anything, because it's an irrational rule, and no one would want to be put in the position of enforcing it. And so immediately, if this passes, we will see a de facto change with regard to the prohibition on adult leaders. Also, as Ed, I'm just going to elaborate a little more on what Ed talked about with regard to their legal rights following the passage of a proposal like this. Remember that in the Dale case, the reason why the Boy Scouts were said to have a First Amendment right to maintain this policy, and this was the very policy at issue, was because they have a First Amendment speech and associational right to hold this policy. Now, what if their speech becomes incoherent? What if open homosexuality is consistent with the Scouting Code, except when it's not consistent with the Scouting Code? If its speech is so incoherent, which it would be, what will the courts, there will be no legal basis for the courts to rule to uphold one part of this bifurcated policy, and lawsuits will ensue, they will win, and if they're not forced as a practical matter to change the policy on adults, they will quickly be forced as a legal matter to change the policy on adults. And as I said, in my opinion, this is all by design. Now, another consequence of this particular resolution passing is what I alluded to earlier. If the experience at the Girl Scouts is any guide, then this is what the Boy Scouts will have to look forward to. Many people may have read the news in 2011 of that very unlucky Colorado Girl Scout troop leader who was presented with a 7-year-old transgendered boy whose mother wanted him to join the troop as a girl. And that leader told the mom, "I'm sorry, your son can't join our Girl Scout troop because he has boy parts," which I thought was logical and quite diplomatic. But the leader was chastised and overruled promptly by her superiors and forced to admit this poor little boy to the Girl Scout troop as a Girl Scout. Isolated incident? No. According to the Girl Scout officials, this kind of request happens twice a year and has for years now. And of course, what are the poor little girls in these troops? What are they asked to do? How are they asked to act? It's a mess. And this too is what the Boy Scouts will have to look forward to if this resolution passes. Perhaps that's also by design. Now, last year, there have been 2 surveys of Boy Scout families with regard to this issue. In 2000 was the big victory. 10 years later, a survey was conducted. Actually, it was a 2-year study to determine whether the Boy Scout families wanted to keep this longstanding policy. And the result of that survey was that the vast majority of families said, yes, indeed, we would love to keep this policy. And after that survey was released again last year, the results, the Boy Scout leadership said, no change in policy. But then we see what happened in January. January, rumors about, well, there is going to be a change of policy. What is it going to entail? Maybe local option, maybe something else. It sent a lot of waves of confusion through the Boy Scouts. And then we have in February a new poll, even just months after this extensive 2-year study comes out showing an overwhelming support for the longstanding policy, a new poll is taken. And this can only fairly be described as a push poll. Very slanted, very deceptive, 13 questions. The lead, which I thought was worth reading, the lead scenario describes a boy who joins as a tot, dutifully fulfills all requirements for all through the years until at the moment he stands before the review board to receive his Eagle Scout, he reveals that he is gay. Is it acceptable for the board to deny him the Eagle Scout award? Now, the survey instructions, which they certainly accidentally made public, require the survey takers to read this scenario first every single time, but to rotate the other scenarios involved that mention the sharing of tents and gay male troop leaders who, naturally, follow the youth protection guidelines is another scenario. But even this poll went wrong for the executive committee because the result was 61% of Boy Scouting families still want to maintain the current policy, a higher percentage of troop leaders still want to maintain the current policy, and an even higher percentage of chartering organizations want to maintain the current policy. Now, it was a stunning repudiation of this movement to change the policy. But the news reports didn't read that way, did they? It read as a triumphant Boy Scouts pose to change policy. Boy Scouts want to change their policy and open gays. How on earth could all these reporters get this survey wrong? Get it so wrong, stunningly wrong? It's because the executive committee issued this media statement to describe the results of this February poll. Quote, while perspectives and opinions vary significantly, parents, adults in the scouting community, and teens alike tend to agree that youth should not be denied the benefits of scouting, end quote. What? That's world-class spin. Now, an honest Boy Scout might craft a statement like this to describe the poll. While scouting parents, troop leaders, and chartering organizations still overwhelmingly oppose any change to the membership policy, we're going to do it anyway. Now, there is going to be a showdown in Texas next month, Grapevine, Texas. And many delegates are rightly concerned that it's not going to be a fair fight. Here are some questions that should be answered. There's troubling reports about an influx of delegates who will be coming to vote. Who are these delegates? Are they even credentialed to vote under the bylaws? The executive committee does not want their names released. Second, typically votes at meetings are done by voice vote. It's very clear for people participating in a voice vote. You can observe whether a resolution passes or not, and so forth. This vote, no voice vote. It's going to be a paper ballot filled out in the delegates' hotel rooms. No amendments allowed, apparently, according to the executive committee. And who's going to count these paper ballots? Friends of the executive committee, perhaps? And how can anyone be sure that this process is going to be conducted fairly? Just a final point that you may have seen, as I did yesterday in USA Today, that the atheists are back, and they're lining up to take a whack at the Scout Oath. And, for an organization with such unpopular and offensive views, there certainly are a lot of people lining up to get in. Doesn't make a lot of sense. What I see is a strong potential alliance between the gay activists and the atheists. They could form a scouting organization called the Progressive Scouts of America. All the corporate sponsors of the Boy Scouts that are getting cold feet or just getting tired of being beaten up on by the gay activists could all rush to their aid. They would be the most wealthy scouting organization in America. Wayne Perry and Tico Perez could be invited, the leaders of the Boy Scouts, with a red carpet to join the leadership of this new scouting organization. And they could decide they want to focus more closely on environmental matters. They could have global warming badges, 15 different types, whatever they want. They could set their own standards, their own guidelines, their own membership rules. They could even copy everything the Boy Scouts have done, except with regard to the things they find so offensive. They would be a stunning success if you listen to their own arguments. And, God bless America, unless that's offensive to them. I mean, they bless America. So it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And I'm looking forward to the questions. Thanks.
Good, thank you. John, what's up?
Thank you, Matt, for the opportunity to visit here and speak. I think a little bit about the history here. After the Dale decision in the year 2000, the gay rights community began to put pressure upon the BSA, and that pressure culminated in a study, 2-year study, with 11 volunteers from 2010 to 2012. At the end of that study, which just was released last year, the Boy Scouts concluded that this is, quote, the absolute best policy, close quote, for the Boy Scouts. The absolute best policy. 11-member unanimous decision just last year. And a small bit of a personal story. Directly across from my law firm is a small chicken wing pizza place that I go to every now and then. And Tico Perez, who is the national commissioner, he's the highest person in scouting, highest volunteer in scouting as part of the Key Three. I actually know him. I grew up in scouting with him. He's a prominent lawyer in Orlando. And so I visited and said, hey, what's going on with the membership thing? Because I knew there was a controversy. And he said, no problem. We got it locked down to Key Three. No, Wayne Perry's a strong LDS supporter. He says, not going anywhere. And he said, but man, we're getting hit with pressure. We're getting all kinds of vitriol from the gay rights community, and they're pounding us. And I just said, hey, let me create a national network to give you guys cover and help you out. We'll present positive reinforcement. I said, let me do that for you. And he seemed to think that was a good idea. And so we left that meeting, and twice I emailed him and texted him and never heard back. I said, tell me who to write and what you need, and show you that America supports scouting and supports scouting membership policies. Never heard back. 6 months later, I'm in Naples, and I look down at my phone, and I see NBC News breaking. They're opening the thing back up again. And I call them and say, what in the world's going on? And so the point I want to make here is that this is not a decision that's done for anything other than because of peer pressure. And what are we saying to Boy Scouts who are trying to teach to be brave when we as adults can't stand up to the peer pressure of our own peers in Hollywood, in Washington, D.C., here in the Beltway, and in other places? I mean, this is what this is all about. And they categorically deny, Nathan Rosenberg, who did the presentation to the delegates, denied it has anything to do with peer pressure. It has everything to do with peer pressure, because their own presentation took public polling, showed how America's changing their views on gay marriage, how America's now has different views regarding whether homosexuality is a moral thing or not. And so clearly they're looking at not what the scouting community thinks is best or what's best for the boys, they're looking at what's best for someone else that's outside of scouting, and that's unfortunate. In all the common law and all in statutory law, anytime there's children involved, whether it's divorce or custody disputes or adoption, or as a guardian ad litem, when I go before the court when there's abused or neglected child, and I do this as a volunteer for 13 years in Orlando, the court wants to know one thing, and that is what is in the best interest of the child. And what's unfortunate is the Boy Scouts of America completely ignored that question. That's really the only question they should ask. What is best for the boys? And instead of doing what's best for the boys, they've done what's best for some activists in Hollywood and Washington, D.C. And that's very unfortunate. The single most important thing that I think delegates who are watching this presentation should know is something that Ed Whalen mentioned, and that is this. This is absolutely a proposal, not just for young people, it's for adults. And within 2 years, immediately, as soon as this goes into an act, they'll find a 17-year-old scout in good standing who turns 18, is denied to be an assistant scoutmaster. This is what I did when I turned 18. I was assistant scoutmaster. And he'll become a plaintiff in a state where there is a non-discrimination, which are really tools to attack people who have views that are different than other people. And it'll be used, and it'll open the whole thing up within 2 to 3 years. The whole thing will be open wide up. So if you're going to vote for this, understand you're voting for open homosexuality amongst adults and youth. It's only a matter of time. And the BSA won't have to change their policy. The courts will do it for them. So that's the most important point that delegates need to understand. It's not enumerated, but it's a de facto reality of our world, and if they retreat from this, from the principles of Dale, which this will do, they'll have no defense in terms of right of association. The other point I think is important is that currently, Scouting does not discriminate based upon sexual orientation. It says so right in the application. I mean, it says that they don't ask, there's no inquiry about it. And so those of us who've been around a while in the program know that there are people who are homosexuals, and people who have a same-sex attraction in Scouting. There just are, but they're discreet, they're appropriate. They do not looking to kind of wave flags and make a big deal about it. And what's ironic is that every news station is saying that Scouting bans gays, but yet you look in the news and you're seeing people who have been there for many, many years in uniform, Eagle Scouts, adults. Well, what happened? Well, what happened is those people engaged in conduct and behavior which was a distraction of the mission of Scouting, and that's why they were removed, not because of some issue of sexual orientation. And so instead of having the courage to defend their current policy, they're basically caving to pressure. They're coming up with what they think is a clever strategy by which to do something that's a change, that looks like it's a change. I don't think they understand the implications, the unintended legal consequences of this, and all of that. And so I think there's some good faith at some level of trying to strike a compromise to get the pressure off of them and still maintain behavioral standards, but you're just not going to be able to do that because of the legal aspects of these things. So that's, I think that's the most important point to be made, and I'll just save any other information for questions.
Thank you. Thank you to all three panelists for laying out the risks of changing the Boy Scout of America's membership policies. I'd like to take some questions now, if I could. I want to ask one first, just to clarify a technical point. This is for Ed, but the others as well. Ed, in changing this policy, am I correct in understanding you that because of the confusion this will sow, that this essentially is the Boy Scouts intentionally kind of taking themselves out of the protection of the Dale decision as an institution? And if so, this will go beyond this question of membership to other questions about religious liberty and beyond in terms of the protection of the institution. Am I understanding that correct?
Well, you're certainly understanding it correctly with respect to the question of homosexuality. Again, if this resolution is adopted, if this policy change is made, it seems to me extremely difficult for the Boy Scouts to maintain that it continues to be their position that homosexual conduct is inconsistent with the values they seek to instill. The question posed by belief in God is a different one. I don't think there's anything in this that goes directly to that. I do think that the kick me sign that they put on themselves may have consequences, but I don't think this resolution itself would directly affect that.
Right, as a legal matter.
As a legal matter, right.
Can I comment on that, Matt?
You may, please.
The basis for this whole change is public polls. They didn't look at the Scout law, they didn't look at the Scout oath, they didn't look at history or tradition or what happened in other youth programs. They looked at polling. And not even polling within the Scouting community, they looked at polling for the general public. And so we live in an increasingly secular society, even though our foundings are godly in nature, one could argue. As we become more increasingly secular, there seems to me if they're going to govern by polls, there's really, Matt, no way for them to then say, okay, well, you know what, God becomes now unpopular as well, so we're going to just reevaluate that. Well, I mean,
Right. Certainly
the UK is doing that right now. Canada's already done that and allows atheists also.
Right. At the very least, it would suggest that an organization that fought to the Supreme Court and won a case based on its maintenance of a certain moral belief, giving that up would suggest that in other areas, perhaps they aren't quite as firmly committed. Questions? Tom?
Thank you. So we know that 70% of Scout units are chartered by faith-based groups, and over half of those groups are Mormon and Catholic units. And I think that we've seen sort of a tacit embrace by the sort of Mormons on this, and I haven't seen a statement from the Catholics on this. And I'm wondering whether that's motivated by sort of a concern to have a little bit more flexibility than the current policy provides to accommodate hard cases. So what do you say to that? Because what I've heard from the panel today, that is, even if that is sort of the motive, that this is just going to be a disaster, it's going to completely undermine their ability to sort of promote family values through scouting programs and things. But how do you address those concerns? What's the best answer for people who are sort of thinking that as they go to vote? And then just a follow-up question for John is, if the Scouts don't make this change, what do you say to people who say that's going to just financially destroy the Scouts unless they make this change?
Well, it's just the opposite. If they make this change, it's going to utterly devastate the program by their own numbers. Their own numbers show that if they make this change, they will lose somewhere between 200 and 400,000 people. That's just youth. Now, I figure for every youth, there's a parent tied to that. So you're talking about upwards of well over 500,000 people just exiting the program over a short period of time. They also estimate their own numbers, which I think are very conservative, is that $30 million will be lost from their own budget. This corporate sponsorship business, it's a very small part. Scouting's $300 million budget is primarily from major donors, family foundations, land acquisitions, kind of big donor grants. And these are not traditionally left of center people. These are more conservative, traditional types. So they're going to really hurt themselves significantly in terms of the heart and soul, gutting the kind of human capital, the parents and the scout leaders that make up this. Also the denominations, many of the local churches, certainly the Southern Baptists, have made it clear they're going to, as a whole denomination, withdraw. But certain Catholics and even LDS, despite the political statement that they made, you're going to see them back off. So it's going to transform scouting into something that really is quite different than what we have
Others
now.
on this general question?
Sure. Well, let me address the hard cases aspect of your question. The fact is, the existing policy allows considerable flexibility precisely with respect to those cases. Again, as John and others have made clear, the existing policy doesn't have some sort of flat ban on gays. It says you may not have open or avowed homosexuals. So a kid who's struggling or tells a scoutmaster, I'm gay, there's scoutmasters all over the country who work with him on that, who work with him to continue in scouts, I mean to say, and do not view that as grounds for exclusion. What you have with this new policy is you're opening up a can of worms where suddenly what is permitted, what isn't, is completely unclear. And I think this will create far more problems than it would supposedly solve. I do want to, I think, take issue with one premise of your question. I think the position taken by the LDS Church is best stated as one of non-opposition to the policy rather than a tacit embrace, as you put it. That said, I'm sorry to see that the LDS Church did not really address the question of how it thinks or imagines that the policy against openly gay adult leaders can be maintained if this policy change is made.
Kathy, anything to add? No. Okay. Other questions?
Adam Brickley. My question was, if we keep moving forward on these changes, I'm wondering if you think this is eventually going to disintegrate into a situation where we're not only going to be allowing certain people into scouting, but whether or not there's now going to be hate speech regulations, and whether the organizations that are pushing for the change now are going to be interested now in installing codes that will result in the expulsion of people who belong to religious groups that do not affirm homosexuality from scouting.
You want to do that?
I mean, there's nothing currently in the policies that you're asking kind of a hypothetical future question, and so it's hard to answer that. But certainly, one of the matters that touches on what you've talked about, and this is very distressing because the Scouts have said that there's no increased risk to youth. I find that remarkable. Actually, I find it remarkably bordering on dishonest. They know specifically this will increase. I mean, I was told by a very top official this is going to increase boy-on-boy contact. And so, and it's real, I was never concerned about the adults, frankly, because adults, we have a very strict 2D policy. No adult can be alone at any time with any child. It's very strict. Anybody that's in scouting has to go through youth protection training. It's one of the best in the world. But you can't regulate boys like that. And so, and it's not because, it's because boys are boys and they do impulsive and risky things. So clearly there's going to be an increased risk of this. And it's very sad that the scouts are just kind of turning, there's no even evaluation. They didn't even do a risk analysis. They just kind of denied it. And so that's a very troubling thing to me.
I want to just, excuse me, this is one of the reasons why it's so important for the Boy Scouts to stay within the shelter of Dale. Dale granted them such a victory based on their First Amendment associational rights. They changed their speech, they're going to lose Dale. They lose Dale, they open themselves up to any number of things. The predecessor to Dale was Roberts v. United States J.C.'s. And one of the points the court made was that these free speech and associational rights become most important for organizations that hold unpopular views, and to protect these organizations who may hold unpopular views from being suppressed by whatever the majority view is on any given issue. Now, don't we see that playing out today? I mean, isn't this exactly what we see when states and localities try to punish the Boy Scouts for being Boy Scouts with this particular membership policy? They can't do that under the Constitution. You can't punish an organization for expressing their First Amendment rights. But once they get out from under Dale, anything is possible.
This does get back to the point about sowing moral confusion in terms of the policies. And here I want to point out a contradiction, perhaps get you guys to comment on it, that's not been drawn out as much but caught my attention. Because as we know, when you put down a premise into an argument, oftentimes the premise is carried out logically, which is what is at issue here. When I look at the Scout handbook, paging through it, my son's handbook, it speaks about fatherhood being a responsibility with powerful consequences in your life and the lives of others. It talks about waiting until marriage to have sex. That's a wise course of action. It talks about true maturity coming from acting ethically. It talks about understanding your responsibility towards women. But then it strikes me that one of the other changes here that we've not focused on as much is the following statement. The Boy Scouts of America does not have an agenda on the matter of sexual orientation or resolving this complex issue. It is not the role of the organization, and nor may any member use scouting to promote or advance any social or political position or agenda. Does that not, played out logically, undermine their ability to uphold basic things that got to the ethical core of their purpose?
I suppose they may be
And
drawing.
I'm not here necessarily as a legal matter, but
Yeah.
just as a logical matter in terms of how this is going to play out.
Well, it's a rather clumsy statement. I think read most charitably, it may be suggesting a distinction between social or political positions and moral positions. And the agenda may be meant to refer specifically to some set of positions that you're advancing. So I think it's possible to read that sentence more narrowly. But more broadly, I think is the point you raise is a troubling one. There are all sorts of aspects of Scout teaching that will be deeply affected if, especially if, as I expect, the policy against openly gay adult leaders would crumble. But even having openly gay Scouts, what does it mean in the Scout Oath to be morally straight? Who discusses that? Who explains that? What positions are permissible? Likewise with aspects of the Scout Law, with the Family Life Merit Badge, a whole host of other things. I think there will be moral confusion where previously there had been coherence, and it's that moral confusion that explains why this policy would ultimately crumble.
Kathy?
You raise an extremely important point, Matt, because the Boy Scouts, their own rules and regulations in their charter say that the Scouts, that the organization may not take a position on political questions. Now, this resolution, it seems to me, advocates the acceptance of homosexuality and homosexual behavior. And that's, I think, arguably a political position. I mean, it's one of the hottest, it's the most hot issue in politics today. So, I mean, this resolution, by its terms, violates the terms of its own charter and rules and regs. So,
Matt, the point that I would make, and it's a good point that you've made, but just kind of a collateral point, is that I'm holding the resolution. There's 12 whereas clauses, and there's 140 words that say let it for the resolved. My understanding, and you could do a Google, I mean, whereas clauses are not legally binding. They're kind of clearing your throat, they're symbolic, they're preparatory, but they're not legally binding. What's the policy is those 141 words after therefore let it be resolved. And all the great things that they put in there,
Right.
they're symbolic and trying to
Right.
assure us are in the whereas clauses, not in the policy
Right.
itself.
Although as an institution, it's a premise upon which they're going to act. Yes, sir.
Indeed.
Yeah, Lou Preby, I've been an Eagle Scout.
Hold on for the microphone so we can, thank you.
My name is Lou Preby. I've been an Eagle Scout since before some people in this room were born, 1955. The Scout oath very prominently says morally straight, but it also says mentally awake. And I'm wondering whether the formation of this policy, the leadership was morally awake. My question is, they use the term open and avowed. This is very ambivalently worded. That means practicing. That means behavior. And the question is homosexual behavior consistent with the moral values of scouting? I don't know how they came to the conclusion that it is. And the implementation of this policy as it's proposed would appear to have devastating unintended consequences. I can't see how this is, in a realistic world, how this can possibly be implemented without opening the door to lawsuits, membership losses. There's nothing good about this as I see it passing. If one of those leaders that crafted this policy were here, how would they try and justify it?
Well, I think I'll try an answer to that. First of all, I think there are at least a couple members of the Executive Council who, in their own corporations, the corporations of which they're CEOs, have very left-wing diversity agendas. And it seems quite clear that they are importing those diversity agendas and seeking to impose them on the Boy Scouts rather than doing their duty to the Boy Scouts and carrying out its traditions and its beliefs. So I fear that there are some people in the Executive Council who are mentally awake in trying to bamboozle everyone else. I think there must be some other people on that council who aren't really paying attention or thinking very carefully.
Well, I assume that's why they added the statement about any sexual conduct is a violation of the virtues of scouting, but also the one I read about we have no policy preferences on these matters, right? That somehow the argument would be that those couch this other statement, so it's now about so behavior, advocacy, those kind of things are not allowed. But your point is that's not a stable policy.
Well, especially
One could make a reasonable argument that on the face of it, this might seem to be a nice setup, but it's not.
Well, let's probe a little more deeply, I think, what the implicit logic is of the existing policy. The notion is that you are condoning homosexual conduct when you have leaders who are openly homosexual. I think that's the clear logic. Well, again, the problem with the proposed revised policy is that you will have scout leaders, youth, who will be allowed to be leaders within their troops who are openly homosexual. So the same inference that clouds and contradicts the message that the Scouts used to claim that they stand for will be there. And again, I emphasize the Scouts have not, conspicuously have not repeated the proposition that they used to tout all the time, that homosexual conduct is inconsistent with the values they seek to instill. You won't see that anywhere in any of these materials.
Just one clarification on what Ed has said here, so everyone, our listeners understand this, that the scouting is organized so that when a boy comes up into scouting, the boy themselves becomes a youth leader. And the adult leaders, their role is not to actually run things, but to oversee them, and the youth leader takes on a key role. So the distinction he's making about youth leaders versus adult leaders and that confusion is an apt one, given how it actually operates. Yes, sir, right here.
Linwood Bragan, Capstan Council for Policy and Ethics. It seems that the cultural import and impact of this is to drive beyond an acceptance of homosexuality, which it seems like from what Ed said, you can be accepted if you're not openly and practicing it. But it seems to be wanting to drive one to approval of it, and then go beyond that even to ultimately applauding that behavior and forcing that cultural change within scouting itself.
Clearly, the policy does, it's not optional. It forces every single unit to accept openly gay boys up to the age of 17. So, I mean, that's, you know, the whole, it doesn't respect or reverence the convictions of the vast majority of the charting partner religious units that actually sponsor. I mean, the LDS Church, the Methodist Church, the Catholic Church, and the Southern Baptist, that makes up the vast majority, the 70% of charting units. And while all of those denominations would respect and would take in their own churches young people and even adults who have a same-sex attraction or struggling with it or what have you, none of them would take in a person that's promoting something and kind of loud and proud, if you will, to use the culture's own words, and kind of in direct defiance of what the church would teach. And that's the difference here. And everybody understands we're not talking about sexual physical contact. Everybody's against that. The hard part is how do you regulate innuendo? How do you regulate symbolism and speech and images and, you know, all that comes within the gay culture. And so that's the problem that scouting doesn't see and that it has to really understand it's going to have to come to grips with.
Kathy, real quickly, I have an internet question that came up about what happened with the Canadian experience with scouting.
Well, it's instructive. What happened is that they lost 50% of their membership. After they allowed a change with regard to duty to God and open homosexuality. I mean, 50%. And, you know, so as I kind of mentioned at the end of my opening remarks, no one who opposes the resolution that the executive committee has drafted says that boys should not be allowed to be involved in scouting activities. The question is, what should happen in this organization at this time? You know, this organization that was founded 103 years ago with a purpose and a mission and stated rules and decades of history of policy, which has been upheld by the Supreme Court. I mean, this is a very particular circumstance. We have to look at this actual organization, not whether or not people should be involved in scouting. Of course, anybody who wants to be in scouting should be in scouting, but should this force be changed, should this change be forced upon this organization at this time? I mean, that's really the question.
We'll go in the far back. Gentleman right here. Yes, sir.
Assuming the worst and that you lose, is there any...
I'm sorry, meaning losing the National Council vote.
That's correct.
Correct, thank you.
That it comes out just as badly as all you people are saying. Is there any talk, or just doing the opposite of what Kathy Roos said in her remarks, of forming an alternative classic Scouts organization, like Coca-Cola, you know, rather than just, if the Scouts in fact are gutted, and they probably will be, as happened, as you say, happened in Canada, any talk by the Southern Baptist or anybody else of forming an alternative traditional scouting group?
Well, first of all, I think this is a very winnable battle. I mean, as long as the delegates can hear this kind of message, which they're not hearing from the BSA, that is frank, candid conversation, I think this is very winnable. Because the average scouting is not ideological. They're concerned about the boys in the program. That's why they're there. They bleed those boys, and they want to see them grow up to be men. So if they can hear this, we're going to win. Secondly, yes, you're correct. I mean, if this goes the wrong way, you'll see all kinds of splinter groups. You'll see the Royal Rangers and the Royal Ambassadors. You'll see probably the LDS form their own program. The American Heritage Girls, which is the official partnering organization of the BSA, will probably have an American Heritage Boys. But we're very hopeful that this is going to be a victory.
Well, there could be a step. There could be a step between those two options, and that could be voting out the Boy Scout leadership and reinstating the longstanding policy. I don't know how practical that is, but before starting up a whole new policy, I mean, it's clear that the people, the millions of people who make up the Boy Scouts in America, do not want this change, statistically speaking. Even with bad polls will tell you that, with better polls will tell you that, all polls will tell you that. So, you know, I don't think we should give up on the ability of those people in Scouts, the vast majority of them, to kind of get Scouting back on the right track if this should happen.
I would just emphasize that the Boy Scouts have an incredible network of campgrounds throughout the country, facilities that it would be impossible to replicate. Just think of Philmont in New Mexico. Look, we may be forced to an option like that, but this battle ought to be fought and won before we even begin to think about desperation measures like that.
Oh, there's a microphone, thank you.
Hi, I'm a college professor, but I'm going to talk as a mom. I have 3 boys that have started, Christian here, started Boy Scouts or Cub Scouts as a tiger. He's a life now. And he also has a leadership role as what they call a den chief. So he actually oversees his little brother's den. Now, of course, all the things that we can talk about legally, but practically, and I really resent that the executive committee would ignore the moms of Boy Scouts of America. My husband's in the military, so when he's been gone, the Boy Scouts have been there. We've poured in thousands of hours, not to mention, volunteer time and funds for Friends of Scouting. For them not to listen to parents at the local level is very concerning. And it begs the question, this executive committee, who are they? How much are they making? I mean, is this a financial issue or what? How can they change a policy unless it's something to be better?
Thank you. Any thoughts or?
Well, I'll just talk process again. I'm doing a lot of that today, but the national board actually has the power under the bylaws to make this change themselves. They don't want to do that. We know what they want the change to be, but they don't want to do that because of the backlash, because then they would immediately be voted out and other people read, and so forth. So they are conducting phony polls and putting out phony press statements to make people think that everybody in Scouting is on board with this change. Ed mentioned this, I think, or John, that this February poll where they purport to have listening sessions with parents, you read the fine print and you see that they're not even talking to parents, exclusively parents who are in the Boy Scouts. I think John mentioned this. So if parents of kids that aren't in Boy Scouts, is that really the best place to find out what Boy Scouts should do? I mean, what the organization, of course not. So this is how deceptive they're being, how manipulative, and this is why I think this resolution is by design. That it's not a compromise, it's a designed Trojan horse or something to bring in, openly homosexual Scout leaders. I mean, there's nothing that we have seen in the last couple of years, but mostly the last year, to suggest that these people are playing honestly with this.
I do think the vast majority of the people making this decision do have good faith, but I think there's a smaller group, they're very smart, they understand the politics and the law, and they're setting up for change that's going to be major. And that's the problem, is they're being, to use the word, bamboozled. I mean, and so we're trying to alert the delegates they need to vote no to this for that very reason.
I would just add that I believe that most or all of the members of the Executive Council are volunteers who don't get paid. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have other interests that they're pursuing. Again, I mentioned that one of them is the head of AT&T, another the head of Ernst & Young. Ernst & Young, it turns out, is an independent auditor of AT&T. So these two who are really pushing this change, I think, are responding to folks putting pressure on their corporations and are responding to the diversity agenda that they themselves have been pushing within their corporations. So there are these deeper conflicts of interest. I think they have nothing to do with any pay that they're receiving for their jobs, though, for their Scout positions, I would emphasize.
I would add that Nathan Rosenberg, who is a former president of the Orange County, California Council, he has a consulting firm. It's his job to kind of figure out the plan to sell this. He's on the national committee. He's being paid a very handsome sum, and he's on the board at the same time, which I find to be interesting because usually board members are not supposed to have a financial interest in the outcome of a matter. But certainly he's being paid a very handsome sum, and he's the one kind of working on the messaging of how to sell this to the delegates.
Thank you, John. Thanks to the panelists. On my honor, I will do my best to do my duty to God and my country, and to obey the Scout law, to help others at all times, to keep myself physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight. Much of our policy discussion here has been about the morally straight part. But as was pointed out, and I had noticed this as well, it's also very important to remain mentally awake, which we take to mean a question of being educated and enlightened about the choices before you. And we hope you will join us in trying to make sure those in the National Council making this decision will be awake to the risks involved, to scouting, to the great works they do, and to the moral and ethical behavior it represents for all of us. I thank you for your participation in this discussion, and have a good day. Thank you.